As the United States reverses its previous climate commitments and once again embraces fossil fuels under Donald Trump, China has signaled it is dedicated to the green energy transition and has for the first time set a concrete target to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2035. President Xi Jinping made the announcement in a video message to the UN this week. Despite the pledge, the proposed reduction of 7 to 10% trails the 30% cut in emissions that climate analysts say is needed to meet the goals set by the Paris Agreement. China says it also plans to expand wind and solar power capacity, increase forest areas, and increase electric vehicle sales. Well, in his address to the UN, Xi made a subtle reference to the U.S., saying some countries were going against the trend on climate action, and he urged other countries to stay on track.
China will, by 2035, reduce economy-wide net greenhouse gas emissions by 7% to 10% from peak levels, striving to do better. Great visions require concrete deeds. Climate action is an urgent yet long-term task. Let's all step up our efforts to realize the beautiful vision of harmony between men and nature, and preserve planet Earth, the place we call home.
Well, with the United States withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement for a second time under President Trump, the world is now even more dependent on China to take a leadership role in slashing emissions. At the UN General Assembly this week, Trump put his climate change denial on full display.
It's climate change, because if it goes higher or lower, whatever the hell happens, this climate change, it's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion.
Belinda Schäpe is a China policy analyst with the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Welcome, Belinda. Now, we're seeing the world's largest emitter announcing a target to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions for the first time. How big a deal is this?
It's quite a big deal, yes. For the first time, China has announced total emission reduction targets covering all greenhouse gases in all sectors. And the fact that President Xi Jinping personally announced these targets signals the high-level commitment that China puts to tackling climate change. However, unfortunately, in terms of ambition, these targets are not quite enough yet to align with the goals of the Paris Agreement, which would require around 30% of emission reductions by 2035. But the good news is that China is very capable and likely to achieve much more than this. Our analysis suggests that the 30% emission reduction is indeed quite possible with the current trends that we are seeing in China's clean energy sector. And it is also possible if China is going to deliver the targets it has already set for 2030. So we should see today's targets certainly as the floor of ambition and not necessarily the ceiling of what is possible.
Why set the bar so low when China could be aiming so high?
I think there are a number of reasons. Certainly the international environment is not very conducive to China putting itself out there with targets that may be on shaky ground and that may struggle to achieve, because we do see a lot of international backlash on the green agenda. But there are also economic uncertainties in China, and the Chinese approach to climate targets and target setting more broadly has always been to set out conservative targets and then overachieve these as much as possible. So I think this is what we can expect from these targets as well. They are very much the business as usual or even less than business as usual scenario. But the reality of the implementation will hopefully look quite different over the next decade.
You mentioned that the green agenda is being criticized in many places around the globe. What's the motivation behind the Chinese leadership setting this emissions target now?
Yeah, President Xi Jinping has very clearly defined the green transition as the trend of our time and encouraged the international community to stay on the right track against any backlash. There's a number of reasons for China to have these very strong commitments to climate change. The first one is that China is itself very much impacted by climate impacts. It's one of the most vulnerable countries, so it has a high interest in climate mitigation and climate impacts being as low as possible. But then there's also the economic side of things. China sees very high potential in the clean energy industries. They are already becoming a top driver of its economic growth, contributing to a quarter of the economic growth last year. And it hopes that clean energy sectors will provide its also future economic growth. So it sees a lot of potential for this. So I think both of these are very good motivations for China to set a clear direction here.
This announcement comes, of course, on the heels of U.S. President Donald Trump calling climate change a con job in front of the United Nations General Assembly. How much of China setting these targets is in defiance of the U.S.'s climate denialism?
Yeah, Xi Jinping has certainly made a point in centering his speech very in stark contrast to the speech by US President Donald Trump. He has made very clear that China sees the clean transition as the future, and it is very much interested in upholding the multilateral framework on climate change. So this comes in a stark contrast, but it hopefully also gives commitment from other countries and hope for other countries that the major emitter is still on board on tackling climate change.
China is the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, but it also has the world's biggest population. Now, considering many other countries like the U.S. emit much more carbon per person, how does China see its global role in reducing carbon emissions? You already talked about the domestic aspects. Where do they see their responsibilities when it comes to really the global repercussions of a warmer climate?
For a long time, China's talking point has been that developed countries should take the lead in mitigation, and this is still the case. China very much pushes this narrative and sees the responsibility with developed countries. However, China is now not only the largest emitter, but it's also become the second largest historic emitter. So there is an increasing responsibility that comes to China, and it is also acknowledging that. So I think this framing that we are seeing, that President Xi Jinping frames China as a major responsible power in tackling climate change, is a response to that. And China has also shown more commitment to playing a bigger role internationally in helping accelerate the green transition around the world by investing into clean energy projects outside of China, into clean energy manufacturing, and of course also by producing the majority of global clean technologies that are deployed globally.
But they're also still heavily dependent on fossil fuels, especially when it comes to certain sectors of the economy. What's holding China back from doing more here?
Yeah, this is the balancing act that we're seeing. China's growth model over the past decades has been very much built on its coal reserves. China is very rich in coal, and this has been the base of a lot of industries that China has developed domestically that have brought about the economic miracle that we have seen. In particular, of course, the real estate sector and heavy industry supporting this. So currently, we're seeing a huge transformation away from heavy industry providing this economic growth towards high-tech manufacturing and including clean technologies. But this is a balancing act, and it's also a big challenge for a country like China that includes many, many stakeholders. So for now, what we're seeing is that the government is taking a more conservative approach in the policy setting, but then what we're seeing in terms of real economy development is much faster than that. So the renewables build out and clean technology development has over the past couple of years been significantly faster, and it will be a question on what kind of signals the government will set also in the coming 15th five-year plan on how to balance those two, the growth in renewables and the decline then in coal-based sectors.
Yeah, tackling global emissions is, of course, it's in the name. It's a global challenge. What can other countries learn from China and its green energy transition?
I think the clear policy direction is something that many countries can take away from this. China's political planning is really decades ahead, and they're thinking in these terms as well. And this is something quite useful for a challenge that is such a long-term challenge as climate change. So really setting out policies that guide this direction, that also guide industries in these fields, such as in the way that China has developed clean energy industries, supporting the clean energy build-out that it has brought about domestically. Those are all things that we can learn from China and hopefully work with China in helping that these technologies and this approach to long-term policy making also reaches other countries around the world.
That was Belinda Schäpe from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Thanks so much for all those insights and your time tonight.
Thank you.